Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another thrilling episode of the Charlie and Andre podcast. I'm Andre.
Hello, and I am Charlie.
Coming to you from Rockville, Maryland, outside of our nation's fair capital, Washington, D.C., and Austin, Texas,
The capital of Texas.
the home of hip. All
Yep.
right, so Charlie, we went through two episodes of the first and second age of Middle Earth, taking a sort of bird's eye view of Tolkien's legendary history of this crafted universe he built, and we have one last age to finish before we arrive at the time that all the viewers know and love. This is the third age. So what happened last time is, as we know, Sauron was causing trouble. He forged the rings. He deceived the elves of Eregion, like Celebrimbor, into helping him forge the others and using them to sort of enslave the people. But they realized what was going on and fought a war against him. The Númenóreans were doing their thing until they had the brilliant idea to sail west against the basically gods of Middle-earth, the Valar, and were completely sunk under the sea until a few of them escaped, like the good ones, and landed on the shores of Middle-earth, where they made this last alliance of men and elves and supposedly defeated Sauron once and for all, but as we know, that was not the case.
Yeah, so we're kind of talking about a timeline about 3,000 years in this third age that kind of begins after the defeat of Sauron in the War of the Last Alliance and ends with the destruction of the One Ring and the return of the King, which many of us are familiar with from the movie, ominously named The Return of the King. We'll try to highlight the return of the shadow, of how Sauron returns and his gradual rise to evil during the Third Age, and how he seeks to regain power and dominance over Middle-earth. There's the founding of Gondor and Anor. That kind of relates back to the Second Age as well. Of course, there's the War of the Ring, which takes place towards the end of the Third Age, and the Fellowship's quest to destroy the One Ring, the ultimate defeat of Sauron, and we'll touch on the legendary figures as well, such as Elrond and Galadriel and Gandalf and Aragorn and the White Council. So there's a lot of fun stuff going on over here, and like you said in another podcast, this is the most detailed of all the ages,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, this is the most eventful age as far as, like, we have actual records for. Tolkien put the most detail for this. It's the one that kind of impacts, like, the current events the most. So where to start? I guess, as we mentioned last time, those Númenóreans that escaped, the Elendil and his sons, they escaped. Elendil, along with Gil-galad, was killed in battle against Sauron at that last battle. But his son Isildur cut the ring off, took it, did not destroy it. Tried to go back up to Arnor using the river Anduin, which is like the biggest river in Middle Earth, but was waylaid and attacked by a band of orcs and killed. Just kind of anticlimactic for him after all he did, but I guess he kind of had it coming after what happened. Then the ring sank to the bottom of the river, and as we said, was not found until Smeagol or Gollum found it, like 2,500 years later. But they had founded these two kingdoms, Arnor in the north, in the land, actually part of which became the Shire later, as we'll get into, and Gondor in the south. Gondor, I believe, meaning land of stone, because they use a lot of stone to build their buildings and such. I'm not sure.
I actually have an interesting tidbit about Gondor. I have an interesting tidbit about Gondor as stone. Tolkien was very interested in languages, and evidently there are barely any pre-Celtic languages preserved in from England.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Speaking, and evidently one of the only words preserved from pre-Celtic, like Brittonic languages, is ond, which means stone.
Mm.
So Tolkien kind of takes that as this pre-Celtic, I guess potentially pre-Indo-European language as the basis for creating the word Gondor.
Interesting. I didn't know. Like, is that like Pictish or? I mean, I'm not even sure.
I would have to look into it, but well, isn't Pictish Indo-European or non-Indo or Indo-European?
Actually, I think there was debate about that because there was so little evidence about it. But now, in hindsight, I think Pictish might have been actually a form of Brittonic Celtic that was a bit different from the others and found in like Scotland and such. So maybe that's like the
Yeah,
most relevant
I
example.
mean we're going back to Iron Age,
Right.
Europe, like
Right.
ninth, sixth
Which is
century,
basically prehistoric, right? So
in the sense that nothing was
was recorded. Yeah, yeah.
maintained.
I
Yeah.
mean, the history of Britain essentially started when the Romans invaded in like 43 AD or something,
Well,
technically.
but
So,
granted, there's, I mean, substantial evidence of an Indo-European languages there,
oh,
right?
of course, of course. I'm not debating that, but I'm just saying, like, as far as written history, and that's kind of, I guess, what Tolkien was getting at. He wanted to craft like a deeper history, in some
Yeah.
ways,
Well,
make
I
it
guess like
legendary.
I mean, but when we think of prehistoric Britain, we think kind of the of Stonehenge
Right,
and
the Druids and
the the hand axes and and I mean it's also worth mentioning that potentially Middle Earth looks or like England in a way, right? So it's not too. I mean that might be a bit of a stretch, but I'm sure. I mean the Shire certainly draws on beautiful English countryside,
it might be compared to Europe. I mean, I've seen like overlays or comparisons to Europe.
right?
I don't know. It's iffy, and I think he just kind of wanted to do his own thing, but he
But
left it up
certainly
to
the
the
Shire,
imagination.
but certainly the Shire is definitely a callback to the Britain that he knew growing up. Growing up,
Sure, yeah, of course, yeah.
yeah. But
Um,
anyway,
yeah,
I wanted to insert that little tidbit about Gondor,
yeah.
and
So
let me give a little pun because I give a little pun in the beginning. Go on,
go
or
for
Gondor will be gone done. All right,
it.
there you
Not
go.
bad. So anyway, this land is so these Dunedain, these men of the West, they found these kingdoms, and at first they're very long lived because they still have a lot of that Numenorian blood, and a lot of their kings like they reign for like 100 years or so and live like 200 something years. I think Tolkien actually writes like a list of all the kings of like Arnor and Gondor and kind of the stuff that they did during their reigns. I think early on, like there wasn't too much happening, but like 500 years into the age, um, there was some invasion by the Easterlings into Gondor, but then Gondor like struck back and like conquered a lot of them. I think it was actually a lot bigger than it appears at the end of the Third Age when all the Lord of the Rings is happening. It was a pretty extensive like kingdom. Um, so yeah, they were fighting like
Yeah,
um,
the Easterlings were like all these human peoples who were living east of Mirkwood and the Rohavanian. Uh,
Ravanian and Rune especially. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. They were also known as the Men of Darkness, who were sort of manipulated by the Dark Lord Sauron,
Yep.
and they sort of challenged the free peoples of Middle Earth.
Yeah, and
Uh,
like that goes back to in some ways like the first age when they were like also there were good and bad Easterlings as we discussed.
yeah,
Um, in the Third Age, they seem to be a little more like one-dimensional, though. Although I think there maybe are a few exceptions, but they're generally depicted as like evil and untrustworthy, which that's arguably a bit problematic. But well,
I mean, it's part of maybe the movies how they kind of depicted them. I think towards the end, like they were sort of a lot of them were forgiven and they made peace and they sort of assimilated
exactly, right, right,
just
right.
towards the end. Kind of that long ending that we have at the end of the
Yeah,
Return of the King.
which a lot of people actually did not sit through, from what I hear. But
You
um,
mean the reading or the movie?
the movie, like the ending, was one of the longest endings of any film I ever saw. It was a great great
Well,
movie.
they
But
say that there's three endings to it's the destruction of the ring, the crowning of Aragorn, the return to the Shire, and making peace there, because it sort of becomes whimsical in a way,
yeah,
even though there are some deaths in the Shire. And then there's the final ending where they go to the Grey Havens.
right, and they sail to the west.
Um,
Yeah, and
and Sauron is actually in Bag End when they first get back there, and he's there making a mess of the place, and he's
yeah, the scouring of the Shire.
the scouring of the Shire. Um, and it's sort of sad in a way. Just the whole scouring where the hobbits have to help like their fellow comrades and hobbits overthrow the ruffians who have taken control of the Shire,
Yeah,
right?
it's a weird kind of. I can see why they omitted that from the films because, they won this huge, world-saving, conflict, and then they come back and have to still deal with some other stuff, back home, and it's like it's a bit. I don't know. I say I
Yeah,
can't touch on
I hear
that.
what you're saying. It would. I have a feeling if they focused on that, it would focus too much on like it would take away from the movie, just the arc and the narrative of the movie. But in real life, I feel like that's what life is like. You have
Oh
unexpected
yeah,
turmoil,
absolutely.
organization, gathering allies. They had that confrontation with Saruman. Often your enemy is in, can reach you in your a home. And I mean, I feel like that's a literal. It can be a metaphor thing too.
Yeah,
The
I
enemy is within, even psychologically.
I
Um,
agree exactly. When you least expect it, and it's and sometimes things that like the last battle's not always like the most glorious one, but
and arguably, the last battle is where Sam has to. It's an emotional one where Sam has to say goodbye to Frodo. When
right, yeah,
Gandalf, Galadriel, Elrond, and the other elves go to the Grey Havens. Then they depart to those undying lands.
yeah. But that's at the very end of the age, right? We're
Right,
basically
right,
into the
yeah,
fourth age.
yeah.
Um, I guess back to what we were saying. Yeah, so these kingdoms are doing okay. Arnor and Gondor thriving. At a certain point, like 800 something years into it, there was a division of Arnor. Like the kingdom split, I think, because of some dynastic issues with the sons of the king. It split into three separate kingdoms. Um, Arthedain, Cardolan, and Rudar, and they were still kind of treated as like Arnor, but they this caused like some division, which would later become a bigger deal. Um, about 1,000 years into the age was an interesting event because this was the arrival of the wizards or the Astari, aka like Gandalf, Saruman, Radagast the Brown, and
Mm.
then you had the two other more obscure blue wizards, Alatar and Palando, which went out to the east. But these wizards were actually originally Maiar, which, as we said, were kind of like a lesser tier of like immortal, godlike being under the Valar, and often worked with them. They were sent to Middle Earth because the Valar picked up on like uh, some activity from Sauron, who they thought was defeated, but was actually not. He was still somewhere out in the east, um, building his influence and sowing seeds of evil throughout Middle Earth, and they were sent to kind of combat that in a gradual kind of way. Obviously, Saruman was the white, Gandalf was the gray, Radagast the brown, the other two blue, and they each had different kind of affinities, from what I remember. Right, Charlie?
Yeah, I mean Gandalf the Grey, later known as the White, when he returns in that famous scene in Fangorn Forest in the Two Towers, he says, "I have returned not as I was, but as I was meant to be." He's sort of the most well known of the wizards. He's what that wise and powerful Maya that you described, and he tries to rally the free peoples. and there's also Saruman the White, who's sort of the leader of the Istari. And he's sort of, I guess, like before he sort of turns evil, he's considered the wisest and the most knowledgeable because he
Right.
was sort of the leader of their councils. But it seems that he falls to pride and ambition, sort of becomes corrupted by this power and desire for power. Radagast the Brown, he's the wizard who kind of has that deep connection with animals and nature, and
Nature,
he's
yeah.
less involved in the War of the Ring, but he kind of helps Gandalf. And then there's Altar and Palando, the Blue Wizards. They're sent to the east of Middle Earth with like the goal of dealing with Sauron's influence and trying to get some resistance against him. But we don't really know much about those blue wizards. But it's interesting to think about them maybe dealing with Easterlings and things like that.
Yeah, because I heard there's all kinds of like mostly fan theories about like what became of them. I mean, even Tolkien was ambiguous about it. He hinted at like I think he actually changed his mind over the course of like his life, like what was the deal with them in his letters. But one thing was that like they may have been sent there to combat Sauron, but eventually became actually they fell under his influence and became evil, or maybe not necessarily under his influence, but they started these like cults of their own out east, and like
Oh, interesting.
and
I
the
don't know if
Easterlings would
that's in
like
the.
kind of worship them and stuff, or
Yeah, I mean, like we definitely hear about them in the Lord of the Rings with the Council of Elrond, and his encounters with Sauron. In the Silmarillion, you hear about the Astari in the Valaquenta section, which describes the Valar and the Maiar and kind of
mm-hmm.
their role shaping Middle Earth. And then, of course, you have some reference to them in the Unfinished Tales, which is more a collection of unfinished writings by
Right,
Tolkien,
right.
which includes some additional details about the Astari, including one section that was actually titled "The Astari." Which kind of just talks about their arrival in Middle Earth and their interactions, kind of their purpose, but not exactly a lot of new information.
Right, yeah, unfinished. I don't think I even finished Unfinished Tales, the
I mean,
playthrough.
it's basically just a compendium.
Yeah, yeah, and some of it is already like stuff that we know from other sources, but kind of
Yeah,
different takes on it. But it's still interesting if you really would want to get like the full kind of lore. Um, but yeah, those are the wizards. Radagast is one of my favorite because he's just kind of a whimsical guy who's detached from like other events in Middle Earth and kind of doing his own thing out in the woods, the animals. Almost reminds me a little bit of like Bombadil, but
yeah,
yeah.
I can definitely see a Bombadil vibe because Bombadil is definitely really connected with nature.
And he doesn't want to get involved in like in the big events and conflict
Yeah,
and whatnot. So
and it's interesting. He's the one known as the Brown Wizard. So there's like
yeah,
two white wizards, one brown wizard, and two blue wizards.
yeah.
And I think that's pretty cool.
Until of course Gandalf he takes over the White Post after he dies and is resurrected essentially after the Balrog fight.
the Balrog of
Yeah,
Morgoth.
and Saruman is many colors with his Technicolor dream coat.
Yeah. I mean, speaking of attire, Radagast has a bird's nest. He's described as having a brown cloak and a bird's nest in his hat.
He just wears the bird's nest.
And he has this great affinity through his mannerisms for loving the natural world. I think it's really beautiful.
He's a cool guy. He's the guy I'd want to hang out with if I had to pick those wizards. But
Yeah.
anyway, so yeah, that's the story. They're kind of doing their thing, kind of working with the people of Middle Earth gradually. Obviously, not revealing who or what they really are. Um, then, second millennium, things start to heat up in Angmar, like 1409. There's like a war. So some of the splinter kingdoms of Angmar start becoming corrupted. So if you guys recall, when the rings were forged, there were 9 rings that were made for men, and those actually did their job in turning them into basically slaves or servants of Sauron. Very faithful and very powerful. We all know them as the Ringwraiths, the Nazgul. And these men were once often great kings and lords of men from around Middle Earth and to the east and whatnot. They Their leader was the Witch King. He was sent north around this time, and he set up a fortress um, realm called Angmar in the mountains far to the north of Arnor, and started causing trouble for Arnor, this northern kingdom of the Dunedain, over hundreds of years, until like he's sort of sowing the seeds of corruption, and eventually some of the other kingdoms fell, and um, he outright invaded Arnor in like 19, according to this timeline, 1974, um, and was able to defeat it. But so like the last king of Arnor, uh, he sort of defeated him, but also died, or he I think he escaped on a ship to the north in the frozen Bay of Forchel, and then like froze there or something. But either way, Arnor was basically dissolved, um, and the Witch King's mission over hundreds of years was a success. However, the Arnorians were not completely extinct as a people, because some of their descendants became the Rangers of the North, and the final descendant of these was our boy Aragorn, as we all know. He was actually a descendant of the last king of Arthedain and Arnor, and thus Elendil in that whole line.
Yeah, I believe Angmar follows pretty quickly.
Right,
There's kind of
right.
like a coalition of Gondor and Arnor and the
The
Elves. And
elves actually helped too. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. And there's this famous battle, the Battle of Fornost,
Mm-hmm.
and it kind of goes into destroying the Witch King of Angmar's kingdom. Um, so it's kind of interesting how that kind of compares with the Ringwraiths, aka the Nazgul, um, being the once human kings who were corrupted. Later on, after that, there's I believe probably 30 years or so after that, there's the fall of Minas Ithil. Um,
That's down
I,
in Gondor, though, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
but I mean, I think it's very close to the fall of the Witch King Angmar. Uh,
Yeah.
the Tower City in Gondor's east region, and then it's renamed Minas Morgul, and it's sort
Right.
of marked as a big, significant, increase in Sauron's domain and dominion.
Right. Because at the time, like, so after the Second Age, Mordor was basically evacuated, or there's nothing really left, and Gondor kept a watch on it, and it even built that fortress Minas Ithil in the mountains right next to Mordor. Um, but over time, because they had a bunch of other wars, I think they had internal wars apparently, like the Kin-strife, where they had like a civil war essentially because some of their kings rebelled against the others, and yeah, family drama essentially. And then the Corsair Wars with like the pirates and Black Numenorians. The Black Numenorians were like these kind of remnants of Numenorian colonies far to the south in Umbar and in a desert in Harad, who kind of became evil and corrupted by Sauron and always were a thorn in the side of Gondor. And then the Wayne Riders attacked as well, like another band of Easterlings that were in wagons. And around this time, it kind of the icing on the cake was the fall of Minas Ithil, as you said. I think the
Right.
Witch King like was sent there to do something. I forget the details, but at this point, the King of Gondor was also killed, and the stewards took over. And then they never really reinstated the kingship after that. It just became the stewards, which led all the way down the line to Denethor, until of course like Aragorn reclaimed the throne, as we know.
Yeah. And also allowed Faramir to continue as steward. One thing
Exactly.
that's interesting about Minas Ithil is that it's also known as the Tower of the Moon or the City of the Moon.
Right. While Minas Honor, I think was the original name for Minas Tirith, or no? Was that wasn't there a Tower of the Sun as well? Or
Yeah, Minas Anor is the Tower of the Sun. It's found by Anodian, one of the sons of
Anorian?
Elendil.
Yeah, Mm-hmm.
It's kind of that city constructed as on the eastern side of the Anduin River.
Where like Ithilien, that land in between Gondor and Mordor, around the river, there was like like a war zone in the time of the books, but like I think owned by Gondor for a long time.
Right, right. If you look at the map, it's kind of like it's a southern part of Gondor. It's kind of situated between the eastern borders of Gondor and the western slopes of Ethelduath, the
Mm-hmm.
mountain range over there. And it's sort of to the east of the Anduin River. Actually, yeah, evidently it was known for natural beauty
Yeah,
and
yeah.
sparkling
Speaking
streams
of
and stuff like that.
natural beauty, I played this game called the Lord of the Rings Online, which is like a MMO, like a massive multiplayer online role playing game, and they do a pretty good job at like depicting some of Middle Earth. I think Arnor is especially interesting because it's not like a land that you hear or see a lot about, but they do a good job at showing like the ruins of Numinas, like the capital of Arnor and the lake up there, and like through the other sites. It's pretty
Well, so
cool.
it's similar to like RuneScape and World of Warcraft,
Kind of,
and
yeah, yeah. It's better graphics than both of those actually. Although now the game's kind
really,
of declined, but at
really,
its peak
I
like
mean,
10 years
I
ago, it
know
was
I
pretty
know
good.
people have compared the MMORPG to Final Fantasy 14 or something as
Right,
well.
right, exactly.
Um,
But yeah,
Interesting.
it had a pretty big community maybe like 8 years ago, but now it's not not as big.
Would you say that the graphics were pretty good? And
They're decent. I mean, it started. I think the game started in like 2007 or eight originally, and
yeah, that sounds about right.
yeah, and it was cool because it wasn't purely based on the movies. It was actually a separate, um, a different company that they had their own take on the IP. Uh, so it
Oh,
was good.
interesting.
Yeah.
So it doesn't follow the storyline like.
Oh no, it does. I mean, it actually has certain things that the movies did not have, like Tom Bombadil and whatnot, which is
Oh, no kidding.
yeah,
But you can basically play various classes and races of
yeah, exactly.
Iriador and
Yeah,
kind of. And it was a free to play game, right?
yeah. At least for like the first 20 levels, I think. But then eventually you
Okay.
had to. I'm not sure what the deal is now, but there's a
And it's
lot of
not like
quests and lore.
Civilizations or Age of Empires where you're kind of collecting resources,
No, there were
right?
other games like that. That's an RTS style game. I think what you're thinking
Right,
about
yeah,
is
real time strategy,
uh,
right?
what you're thinking about is the Battle for Middle Earth, which is a decent game, but it just never got as big as Age of Empires or other games like
Did you
that.
play that game, Battle for Middle Earth?
I did, yeah. The second one
Okay.
was pretty good, I'd say, but
Right, and that's basically like RTS, real time strategy. You collect
yeah,
resources, build
exactly, yeah,
things,
and build
and
and attack and fight armies. And,
I mean, yeah, I'm looking at images online. It looks really cool, actually.
yeah,
It does look very similar to Age of Empires, though. But I guess you could also ask, like, aren't all sort of real time
I think that was
strategies?
like that was the OG in a way. I guess Warcraft was another one that was very early in Dune, but we're going on a tangent. But yeah,
I mean, yeah. I mean, we can go back. We were talking about the geography of Gondor, and that's what led us over
yeah,
to that MMORPG Lord of the Rings game online. And before
right,
that, we were talking about kind of the name Minas Anor, and
yeah,
known as the Tower of the Sun or the City of the Sun, which was a sister
exactly.
city to Minas Ithil that later became Minas Morgul.
And
Um,
then at Minas Morgul, yeah, that was the death of Earnor, the last king of Gondor, in 2050, and then all that drama happened, yeah, with the Witch King and everything. The Stewards took over. Um, Around this time, the apparently Thrain, like the king of the dwarves, he established the kingdom of Erebor on the Lonely Mountain. Um, which is known in the book The Hobbit, where they go and reclaim it until the dragon came out of like the
right,
north and took over, as we all know.
the Kingdom of the Dwarves, right?
Yep, there's a
What
lot
what
of.
it
Mhm.
was also established by there was a thriving kingdom there in the Second Age as well.
Yeah, they were all over the place. Those
Yeah,
dwarves.
no, I mean, but at the Lonely Mountain.
Yeah, I think
Yeah,
so. I'm not sure. So then Thorin from Erebor, the Lonely Mountain, later he left and joined the Grey Mountains. But then I think at some point they tried to restore Moria, right? Or Moria was always a kingdom, but then the Balrog woke up and wreaked havoc and chased him out. But the orcs also played a role in that because the orcs and goblins in the Misty Mountains had multiplied during this time, and there was this huge war between the dwarves and the orcs in the Misty Mountain, and
Oh yeah, yeah.
yeah, it got really bad.
Moria is incredible. Also called Khazad-dûm.
Khazad-dûm.
Yeah, and it was this magnificent kingdom in the Misty Mountains, and was sort of just a thriving center of dwarven culture and craftsmanship. And then, Durin the Deathless, which
Mm-hmm.
was the eldest, actually, of the seven fathers of the dwarves. He
Yep.
discovered Moria, makes it like part of the dwarven realms, and the Durin folk are actually known as the Longbeards. But then, like you said, the Balrog awakens, and they encounter the creature and all this stuff, and then it's abandoned, and nothing really happens other than it sort of maintains this reputation as an accursed and forbidden place. But the Fellowship needs to go there, and
Right.
that Gandalf sort of at the doors there. Needs to help them open the door. You know what I mean? At the doors of Moria.
No, the Watcher is there, like the weird squid thing in the lake.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. The doors of Durin, and it has that elven inscription there, which was in the Tengwar script, right?
It
And
was written in what's it called? Ethild?
I think it was Tengwar, right? And it's like you need to give a password.
Speak friend and enter.
Yeah, I mean, it's the doors of Durin, Lord of Moria. Speak, friend, and enter. I, Narivi, made them. Celebrimbor of Eridion
Yeah.
drew these signs, and it's so funny because ultimately, it's sort of symbolic, right? It's like because it's a physical barrier and the gateway to their forgotten realm, but it's also kind of a simple password, right?
Yeah,
Uh,
they were really like overthinking it for the longest time until they
right,
just said, "Hey,
right,
what's the
right.
Elvish word for friend?" And it was like Melon, and they,
But
uh,
I mean, Celebrimbor we talked about in our Second Age podcast. He's that
yeah,
guy who was the elf of the House of Feanor and the grandson of Feanor, who was born in Valinor in the land of the Valar in the First Age, and then he settles over Aragon, and then he, excuse me, collaborates with Sauron, and uh, and then he's the guy who created the Three Rings. So it's funny that they kind of there's this whole betrayal and everything, and he dies um, because of that. But he comes up in this interesting small way in
yeah.
the doors of Moria.
And like in the show, The Rings of Power, which recently came out, they show that even though the elves and dwarves often mistrusted each other deeply, there was some friendship between them. I mean, they tried to show a friendship between Celebrimbor and Durin, or there because Moria was built next to Eregion, where Celebrimbor was doing his work in the previous age. So they got along in some ways, which is interesting. Like, 'cause the very door to that place was
Yeah,
Elvish. But yeah, it was, I mean, it's a pity what happened to Moria. They remember he
and I
said
don't
like,
think
"This is no
we.
mine; it's a tomb."
Yeah,
But
yeah, it's interesting.
I think later in the age, some of the dwarves from the Grey Mountains to the west that they led an expedition to retake it, but they failed. I think it was like
Right. I
Balin,
think
son of
I think it
Fundin.
just continues to be abandoned.
Yeah, but
And
they
I
did beat
believe
the
that the
orcs. Like
Balrog.
they beheaded the orc king and held him as a. I think Thorin Oakenshield or his family did that, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that though, yeah, Moria's fate just remained largely unchanged. It just continued to be a place of darkness. I guess the Balrog was gone, but there was lots of orcs in there and everything.
However, happy ending though, in the Fourth Age, after the threat of Sauron's defeated, I think some of the dwarves are actually sent to repopulate Moria in earnest, and they actually succeed because the Balrog is gone, and many of the
Yeah.
goblins and orcs.
I mean, that makes sense. Yeah. I will say it was interesting because The Fellowship was kind of the first movie I saw. I may have seen like the animated Hobbit prior to that, but I don't fully recall.
I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. I mean, it's they stay true to some of the songs. I know it has kind of a bad rap out there, but um,
It's unique.
yeah, it certainly is unique. Those animated like '70s Lord of the Rings, but it always had like this sense of mystery and wonder. When I was like a kid, we used to play. I mean, like we'd call it like We Were the People, but it was really like kind of play acting. Um, and I feel like Moria really kind of gave that not just a pretense or like a trick or something, but it really kind of gave this uh, feeling that you have mystery and you know like just uniqueness
Yeah.
that you don't really see. And I think it was for that time, like late '90s, early 2000s. I believe it was 2001. So it really kind of captures that vibe. But it kind of influenced me personally because in a role playing sense that I used to do with my friends, like I said, we used to call it like We're the People, where you kind of do this role playing game in our, I guess you would say our latency phase. I don't know, like
Hmm.
ages 5 through 12, basically, more or less, give or
Right.
take.
Right.
You kind of simulate and you fight, and it wasn't just there. I mean, it would be like Helm's Deep and things like that, but it felt like Morio definitely led to a lot of creative thinking amongst my friends, and of course, Lord of the Rings in general. But what do you? I mean, that's just a personal note on all this.
That's really cool, man. No, it sounds like a good time.
I mean, yeah, good times, good times. I mean, it's the same with video games. I don't know. Maybe it's incorrect to focus too much on Moria, but maybe Helm's Deep was more interesting.
Everybody loves him some Helm's Deep.
But let me ask you this: so the Balrog dies basically as he's falling down with,
Can't. Yeah, Gandalf.
and it seems like those chasms are pretty deep, right? Like he's just continually
Yeah, it's
falling.
crazy how like deep. I mean, they fell from the top of that peak all the way to the. Well, no, wait. He fell and then they climbed to the top of the peak and then they battled there atop the endless stair, and
Right.
that's where Gandalf like finally like
There's a lot of
kicked his
hazards and
ass.
peril up there, man. I
Yeah.
mean, yeah.
But anyway, I guess we're going veering a little off the topic. So the timeline now, all this stuff was happening. Another like notable event, kind of in the middle of the age, 2500 or so. There's this huge invasion of like multiple kinds of like Easterlings and orcs and things like that on Gondor. To the point, and Gondor was already weakened at this point because it had lost a lot to the rising power of Mordor and the Corsairs in the south and everything. And
Mordor.
at its weakest moment, the Northmen, which were they were the descendants of like some of the men, if you recall from the first age, who stayed behind in Middle Earth or in like a little more toward the east and north, but still like good men, not part of the Easterlings. They were the Northmen of Rovania, and almost like these. I guess Tolkien meant them as sort of like these Viking or Anglo-Saxon types almost. They rode south, and they were allies of the Gondorians, and had kind of intermarried some of them with some of their kings at some point, I think. Anyway, Eorl, he came to the defense of Gondor against these Easterlings, these Wain Riders, and was thus given the land of Rohan as a gift for that, which was actually before that part of Gondor. Uh, and the land of Rohan is full of like plains and great grassland for these northern men, these tall, like fair men who were had an affinity toward horses and the like. So they found that to be like a perfect place to found a new kingdom for their people. And as we all know, they stayed steadfast allies of Gondor, more or less, until the
Yeah.
end.
Well, it's interesting that when you're introducing the Rohirrim,
Yep.
they have those Anglo-Saxon traits. In the books, their language is known as Rohirric, which
Yeah.
seems to have lots of similarities to Old English and Anglo-Saxon. And one of the phrases actually is considered to be somewhat of a scholarly joke that
Mm-hmm.
Eomer cries. He says, "Veus du, Theoden Hal," which evidently is a specifically West Midlands uh, Old English dialect where Tolkien grew up. So it seems like there's so much uh, connection between Anglo-Saxon and the Rohirrim. So I mean, even like Eomer is like Ehomar, which is
Horse,
another.
right?
Yeah, pardon me.
I think Ao is the Anglo-Saxon root for horse, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I mean Aerolingus
Yeah.
and I mean they're the men of the horse, right? Like Ao is like horse, and mare is connected to that Old English word mare, which is famous or renowned. So you
I
kind of
think,
combine
by the way, interestingly, Ao is, I think it has an Indo-European, it's a cognate to Latin equus, which also means like horse, ultimately. It's an interesting little
yeah,
connection.
yeah. Um, I mean, and horses were so important, of course, to Indo-European expansion.
Right.
Uh,
Although they were not as big in actual Anglo-Saxon culture, but Tolkien, he really like, made the horse very central for the Rohirrim. Tried to
yeah,
make it a
yeah,
little different, more interesting.
yeah. Huelcos,
Yep.
Huelcos. Kind of that reconstructed. But I mean, you can sort of see that in English it's horse, in Spanish it's caballo, in French it's cheval, in Greek it's hippos, like hippopotamus, in Latin it's equus, in Irish it's like cabal.
Some of
Um,
those are not as like I think caballo, like cabalus, that actually comes from like Gaulish, and then horse is a different term, not the Ao thing, but Greek epos is, I think, related from what I recall. But
yeah. I mean, yeah, I guess caballos would have like a Celtic origin.
and like cheval in French, caballo,
I would
cavallo in
be interested.
Italian, cal in Romanian. So
Yeah. I would be interested to see kind of horses and how they functioned in Anglo-Saxon, because clearly there were horses, like the Romans brought them over, and they probably were there even before that time period. But like, what was their function?
I
Um,
think interestingly, I think the legendary some of the first founders of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, which may not have been real people, they were called Hengst and Horsa. Horsa, obviously being the word for horse, so maybe they did have some importance.
well, I mean, definitely, like Boudica is always like, at least as she's depicted, like as a statue in London, she has like horses, and there's actually a Bronze Age horse, the Uffington White Horse, which is a hill, which is kind of this prehistoric hill figure in kind of central, like West England, and I'm not sure exactly where specifically, but it's interesting. Even in prehistoric times in that Bronze Age era, there's this huge, like what we would call maybe crop sketches in South
Uh,
America.
like the Nazca lines, which some people think are
Yeah, like the
aliens.
Nazca lines, but it's and like sheep have been grazing around it for millennia, um, and
Interesting.
it's just very interesting. So definitely there were like at least representations of horses through that time, and the little snaffle bit that you put around their mouth has been discovered there, as well as like Bronze Age carts and whatnot. Um, But I mean, I mean, you think of horses in the Battle of Hastings, 1066. So clearly, the Anglo-Saxons had chariots, had horses that they could fight
Right,
uh,
right.
the 1066 invasion, and not just like horses, but with like saddles and stirrups and bridles and all
Yeah.
that stuff. But I'm guessing like the Normans brought a whole new system of horses, and
Right. I think the Normans were actually more horse oriented than the Anglo Saxons, which mainly fought on
that
foot.
makes sense. Yeah,
Technically,
I mean, just
the chariot had kind of fallen out of use several, actually toward the end of the Bronze Age, although there were some, I guess, usages later. Um, but no, yeah, I agree. And then even the Norse had like some use of horses. So
oh yeah, 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 yeah. It's just interesting to consider like horses reaching an island,
right,
uh, and the type of technology I guess that would be needed to.
carry them
Uh,
over.
yeah, I mean, which is a boat, I guess, because I don't think like a horse could easily swim that distance.
Oh no,
Uh,
no. But I mean, so the Normans were big. They kind of like helped popularize the idea and use of the knight in medieval Europe because they were so
yes,
successful with
yeah.
that. Um,
But I mean, the Norse, I mean, the Prose Edda and the Poetic Edda, they like mention that you can ride horses to the Yggdrasil. I can't remember the poem off the top of my head,
yeah,
but like,
Yggdrasil.
yeah, I mean, those poems mention horses and riding to go see the Yggdrasil, which is
The world tree.
the world tree under Norse mythology or sacred tree. Um,
Fascinating stuff.
yeah, 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 yeah.
But
But anyway,
we're
just
getting a little, yeah, I guess we're getting a little
no,
off
but there
track. But
seems to be an Anglo-Saxon connection that Tolkien is intentionally
oh,
trying to make.
of course.
And I think it's worth talking about the history of horses and even like Bronze Age society having horses in England and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I guess back to Middle Earth. So yeah, some of those Northmen went south, became the Rohirrim. So some of their kin that stayed up there, they eventually founded the Kingdom of Dale, which was like a little town near like the lake near Erebor, the Lonely Mountain, I think. Uh, and we would see them later in The Hobbit.
Right.
Um, Okay, so the dwarves are doing their thing. At some point, Saruman he moved into Orthanc, which was like a tower that the Gondorians had used as an outpost that had fallen into disrepair. At the time, I'm not sure if he was like really evil yet, but he was kind of starting to go his own way among the wizards.
Yeah.
Um,
How are we doing on time, by the way?
we're getting yeah we should probably wrap it up, but we are luckily close to the end.
Or should we do a part two and like
We're
focus?
pretty much at the end.
Okay.
There was like a watchful peace for a while where the wizards kind of kept a watch over events in Middle Earth, and things were actually pretty chill. Um, we forgot to mention around the time of the fall of Arnor and the Northern Kingdom, uh, the proto hobbits, which we see actually in the Rings of Power in the show. The Fallowhides, the Stewards, and what were the other ones? There was another group of like proto hobbits. They moved from like the east in the valleys of Anduin across the Misty Mountains and into Eriador, which is the land between to the west where Arnor was, and were allowed to settle there. And then after the kingdom fell, they kind of crafted their own little realm, although it wasn't even a unified like country. It was just a place that settled. It became known as the Shire as well.
Sure.
Um, and like I think some of the yes certain like the some of the hobbits were more adventurous than others. Some of them were braver and like taller than others, and they're the ones that kind of pushed this migration. Um, I think some of those early hobbits stayed back east near the Anduin Valley and became the people that Smeagol came out of. So in a way, he sort of was like related distantly to the hobbits. um,
Right.
which is actually hinted at in the movie as well. Um, yeah, the One Ring is found around this time by him, of course.
Right. Right.
Um, there was the Fell Winter of the Third Age, like a really bad winter that affected a lot of continents. And finally, like around 3,000 years into it, we get to the point that we all know uh, the Hobbit happens. The dwarves and Gandalf um, beseech Bilbo to help them with their quest to reclaim Erebor, the Lonely Mountain, and steal the hoard from the dragon, the Arkenstone, and all that. And that ends well for the most part, except Thorin dies. But and then the Lord of the Rings happens with Frodo. The War of the Ring, the Quest of the Ring, the reunited kingdom. Saruman goes evil and is defeated. Um, we all kind of know this part, so we probably don't need to go over it, right?
Yeah, I mean, we can always do another podcast where we just focus on the Lord of the Rings
We could,
movies,
because that has like obviously the most
those
information. So
details. Yeah,
let's do that for
I
another
mean,
time.
we could do a whole podcast on the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings. Each movie having one.
Yeah, true. We don't need to make it as long as Peter Jackson made The Hobbit, which I think it was unnecessary to make it 3 movies, but I can also understand why he did that.
I mean, economics and
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah.
But it was
But
still fun.
I think another thing that perhaps is like maybe a concluding remark that could lead into another podcast is
Sure.
like these kind of like stories reflect the hero's journey that Joseph Campbell talks about a lot. The trials of Frodo and Bilbo. Joseph Campbell kind of had studied all these mythologies around the world and kind of comes to these overarching conclusions for recurring patterns in the world, where it's like ordinary world, call to adventure, refusal to call, meeting the mentor. And we could like connect that meeting the mentor as Gandalf, or the test, and the road back, the resurrection, return with the elixir as like the going to the gray dawn. So I think one reason, not the main, well, it could be the main reason, but it's certainly one big reason is perhaps because this kind of speaks to us on a elemental level is why we really enjoy this show or and the book.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah,
Otherwise, people wouldn't be able to relate to it on some level, even though it seems like such a
yeah,
fantastic, kind of distant world, a fantasy world. There's still got to be a way to relate it to the person. You can put yourself in a way in Frodo's shoes and Bilbo, and especially I think that's why the Hobbits are a great choice for that all, because they're not these like powerful, you know, um, long-lived and mystical creatures. They're just simple, guys who enjoy like a hearty meal and good music and laughs and things like that. And
well,
they're
it's
cast into
interesting.
this huge, you know,
Yeah,
conflict.
I mean, I agree with that. I did an audio lecture by Michael C. Drought, which is kind of known to be you know humanities, Middle English, Beowulf, but also Lord of the Rings kind of lecture guy. And he says these different classes and races in Lord of the Rings all have different ways of speaking. He says that the hobbits are like the middle class. Like if you look at it from sort of an economic perspective, the hobbits are the middle class. They have middle class values. The men are like they succumb to corruption, but they're more like nobility. Smog speaks like an aristocrat who's sucking up all the wealth, which is literally what Smog is doing, like sitting on all that gold,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
like making all the land around him useless. The dwarves are like people who are displaced from time because they speak like medieval kind of. They almost seem like weirdos to Bilbo when he first meets them. They're
yeah.
talking about like their long lost gold. Wizards are kind of like these major intellectual people who, there's only one of them in the Lord of the Rings, or excuse me, not the Lord of the Rings, in the Hobbit. Um, and then the elves, perhaps. I mean, it may fall apart a little bit with some of these, but with the goblins, they're like unorganized workers. or maybe organized workers and the trolls, how they speak. They speak like kind of maybe East London unorganized workers, and
Oh
the
yeah, like the Cockney kind of almost
yeah,
accent.
yeah.
Yeah.
And then the goblins speak like organized workers, people who are in organized labor and unions. And maybe this just reflects, Tolkien's perspective on all this. So you have the hobbits, they're middle class. You have Smaug, who's kind of the aristocracy, who's taking advantage of wealth and not really using it. You
Mm-hmm.
have the elves that are kind of like good aristocracy, and then you have like the trolls, which are sort of unorganized labor, East London. Not they don't speak as well educated. The goblins are more organized with like their Goblin King and the Misty Mountains, so they have like a different dialect of speaking. The wizards are like very very rare, but these sort of supreme intellectual authorities. The dwarves are like displaced medieval people who initially seem really weird and out of touch, but maybe can bring us back to where we need to go, the journeys that we need to go.
Some interesting takes on that. I mean, definitely not uncontroversial, but we can always dissect some of these ideas in another episode, and
Yeah, that would be
there's so
awesome. I
much to
would love.
talk about, really. But yeah, I guess this kind of wraps it up, folks. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Charlie and Andre podcast. We will catch you next time. Thank
See you
you.
next time.